whole point is that it configures all the complex AWS stuff under the hood for you.
I remember that it was really interesting when you were talking about the whole data localization issue and then like trying to figure out how to bring the logic of smart contracts, which are like sort of can run everything at once.
How do you know when something is actually being written? Like, how do you know that something actually has been saved on the disk and it's safe to move on?
How do you come up with a number like that? Is that a function of like solving a lot of mathematical problems, or like what exactly is taking that much time?
They're super sophisticated.
I can understand that in like a nuclear fusion perspective, but for some reason when it comes to like software, I don't fully understand why.
How long do you reckon that's going to take? Like 1/3 of the time?
What's actually changed from a technical level, say, like for blockchain in general since 2009?
There's a huge difference between a system that needs to be 99% fault tolerant and a system that needs to be 99.99.
I just get confused when people say things like, oh, we're so early, like there's so many discoveries to happen.
The line of code somewhere in Postgres that solves a bug that was found 10 years ago that no one has ever encountered in 20 years.
Dive into the intriguing world of deep technology and its intersection with business on Technocracy. We're your hosts, Ajay and Loong. Let's explore the breakthroughs and people shaping the future of technology. Technocracy Podcast.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Technocracy. I'm going to kick things off right away with something called Titan CLI. So I'm going to bring up their website because they have one, so I may as well, but it's not particularly informative. So this is kind of like a deeply technical thing. I came across this while reading a forum called Hacker News, which, if you know what Y Combinator is, there's basically this forum that was kind of built by Y Combinator. And I don't know, it's just like a random internet forum for tech stuff. There's all sorts of random shit there, but this came across it. Pretty technical thing. I came across this while reading a forum called Hacker News, which, if you know what Y Combinator is, there's basically this forum that was kind of built by Y Combinator. And I don't know, it's just like a random internet forum for tech stuff. There's all sorts of random shit there, but this came across it. And I kind of liked it because it tied into this discussion that we had been having up to date about this movement away from subscription models towards one-time payment models. So immediately, one of the unique things about this is that it's $25 for lifetime access. And that's just like a very unique model in today's tech world. Usually you're going to slap on a subscription or something like this. But the reason why this is really cool is that it works on something called AWS Lambda functions, which is a fancy way of saying most applications can be modeled as a simple, my server gets a request, I process that request, and it results in a response, and I send you back the response. So you can think of it as like this very linear thing. Payload comes in, some function is applied that transforms that payload into a response payload, and that's the whole lifetime. Some applications don't even need background state. They can just process the entire request at once, right? Like if you think about a translator app, it doesn't need to know anything. Just like, give me the payload, I will translate it, and I'll send it straight back to you. So you don't need all this crazy complex infrastructure, right? Now, in practice, you always need crazy complex infrastructure to deploy stuff. You need a server sitting somewhere. It has a hard drive. It needs RAM. It's got, all sorts of bullshit. But the reality is, at the extreme, you don't need any of that unless you are currently processing a request. If your application isn't currently processing a request, why should any of your infrastructure be on? Like, turn off all your computers, turn off everything, don't use anything, don't spend anything. That's a pretty extreme scenario, but a lot of cloud providers have actually moved in this direction. Because even if you do need state, so even if you're like your to-do list and you've got to save, the to-do items that the person has created previously, while they're not interacting with the app, that data's just sitting there, nothing's happening to it. Right? So again, all your infrastructure except maybe your database can be turned off. And so they created this idea called serverless functions, and AWS Lambda functions is AWS's version of serverless. And they allow you to deploy basically a tiny little piece of code and nothing else, which is very nice as a programmer. And the AWS will automatically turn on the machines that are needed to be turned on when a request comes in, process your function, and then as soon as it's finished processing, it turn everything back off. Now, in practice, it's not actually turning things on and off. AWS operates at such a massive scale that all of its computers are basically always on, and there's always room somewhere for them to run your function. And so this makes it pretty cheap. And for a lot of early stage companies, even potentially getting into the mid stage, it's a very convenient way to build your infrastructure. You don't have to worry about anything other than your code. Very nice. There's a lot of versions of this out there, and most people charge you per month to spin up on their infrastructure. And the dirty secret is all of them just work on top of AWS. And so what this guy has done by doing a one-time payment model, he said, fuck any intermediate layer. This is just a program that runs on your laptop and interacts with your AWS account directly. So he doesn't even have any deployed infrastructure, right? He's got this website that explains what this is, that you can download the binary from it, and that's it. That's literally it. He doesn't have any other infrastructure. So when you run Titan CLI on your local machine, it talks directly to your AWS infrastructure and configures everything for you. Instead of like, Heroku ages ago, used to be one of the popular sort of like intermediates that was kind of going in this direction. And like you worked with them and you had, their fee system per month, but all their hardware just came from AWS, right? And you've got Render these days, you've got Vercel. Vercel's kind of reached a scale now where I think they have a lot of their own infrastructure, but originally a lot of these guys just ran on top of AWS. And so everyone had these serverless function things that you could interact with, but you were just essentially like they're just a middleman. And by moving to a one-time payment model, you just cut out the middleman. And it doesn't cost him anything to maintain this. So he's just pure revenue for him, which is really, really cool. I love this model. And I think could actually be a good model for open source applications because they can bring in revenue, but they don't have to have this complex costing structure. So it's probably for people who are visually oriented, they do have a little video. If anyone who's not technical, it's not really going to make much sense other than looking at this and seeing how quickly he's able to do everything. So there's just like a couple of commands that you need to use. This is pretty typical, right? Like most systems have super simple command line interfaces, but the beauty is that, again, this doesn't interact with his weird server infrastructure. It just interacts with like AWS directly. So he's got his program that he's written, these sort of test functions. And then he's running these basic deploy commands. And these deploy commands are essentially just little wrappers around interactions with AWS.
So I think you had me at pay once Vercel, right? Like I use Vercel for my personal website. I use it for my dad's wedding website. Yep. Now I don't really pay for Vercel because I think the first 3 websites are free. So, it hasn't really changed my life too dramatically, but I can see when I have 5-6 websites, which is probably going to happen sometime this year because I'm just going to spin up random apps. Having this alternative is really good. Now, I don't really understand what Vercel does, if I'm being completely honest. I just know that the UI is just way easier for me to deploy something than going to
and when
AWS.
you look at AWS is insanely scary, right?
Yeah.
And that's basically Vercel's entire business model is like they're AWS, but just like one particular use case. I mean, AWS can be every use case. And so essentially what AWS became is like cloud infrastructure. And then people built their specific singular, cloud service on top of them and Vercel's is serverless functions. So right at the end here, what's interesting is that this guy then goes to AWS and this is the AWS portal. So it's kind of proof that like he's running this stuff directly on your AWS instance and you don't have to.
Do you have to set up your own like EC2 instance or whatever and then connect it? Or
no, exactly. And that's the point is that this CLI takes care of all of that for you.
So then how do you configure do you log into Amazon through the CLI or something? And then
So there's a setup environment which looks at a config file and that config file has your your username. I think it's still targeted at developers because it is CLI based, it's not UI based. But it still just makes it dramatically simpler, right? You're just like, okay, here's my login credentials for AWS. I created my account. I don't need anything else. And then I just run these commands and it's all taken care of for me. And you can see that getting more sophisticated and having more and more commands that allow you to control things a bit better. But the whole point is that it configures all the complex AWS stuff under the hood for you and just presents it as a simple option. And that's essentially all Vercel is. But because Vercel maintains itself as a middleman, they charge you per month. So they're saying, well, if AWS is charging you $1 per unit, whatever that unit is, we'll charge you $2 per unit and act as a middleman and give you all this nice experience. Whereas this guy's essentially saying, cool, just pay AWS the $1 per unit and pay me $25 one time and have the same experience or have a very, similar experience.
It's so funny because I want to be on the anti-SaaS train, right? I've been pitching this and yelling about it. But even as you say this, I'm still probably still going to use Vercel. Like, it just seems easier to me. And like, this just feels like too many steps, and I'm willing to cop the $10-20 a month to pay for Vercel.
What's interesting is that, like, in principle, there's nothing stopping Vercel being a local app that is genuinely just running on top of AWS and is just doing all that configuration locally. The reason why this guy's built a CLI is because CLIs are trivial to build, right? Whereas a UI is a bit harder to build. It's harder to build locally. People don't really like local apps. But if you had Vercel as a local install on your laptop that you pay for once, would you use that instead?
Oh, 100%. And I think this will probably come in like 6 to 9 months, right?
Yeah, and that experience is completely achievable.
Yeah.
It's just not a model that people think about.
Sure. On the point of serverless, like, the way I like to think about serverless is that you could hire a full-time employee and you may not utilize them 100% of the time. Like, you may give them tasks here and there, but like, they're just sitting there and you're paying them for them the entire month. Or you have a commission-only employee that like only does stuff when you have stuff for them to do. And that's basically a serverless function, right? Like, I need you to do this. I'm going to pay for this time that you've utilized. Otherwise, like, I'm not going to pay you. And I think that was like the innovation behind serverless. Do you want to quickly riff on, I remember it was really interesting when you were talking about the whole data localization issue, and then like trying to figure out how to bring the logic of smart contracts, which are like sort of can run everything at once, and then bringing that to serverless. Maybe you end up doing it, I don't know, but I kind of want to hear that spiel again.
Wow. A long time ago, me and a buddy of mine were working on just like a side project that we called Muir. And the idea was basically, one of the challenges with serverless is that it only takes you so far, because at the end of the day, you do have data that you need to access, right? And that's stored user accounts, user data that are needed to process a request, right? So like when we use Riverside to record this podcast, it needs to at least know our accounts, but then it also needs to save the video somewhere. And then when you want to download that video, it's got to get it from somewhere. So this serverless function that turns on suddenly can't be purely stateless. It needs to access authentication information. It needs to access the videos that we've stored in it in order to process the request. The challenge with that is your data is stored somewhere very specifically, and your functions are getting executed somewhere else. And you don't by definition, you don't know ahead of time what that function is going to access. And so how do you put that function like near your data? But you always have this separation, even if it's like in the same data center. There is a server that runs a database, like that's its own program. And then there's a server that runs the logic. And this is how basically every programmer that's listening to this thinks about modeling applications. You've got your server and you've got your database. The server talks to the database. Can we reduce that round trip by putting them near each other? But the fastest way to reduce that round trip is to not have a database at all, right? And have your database essentially as a library. So instead of being an external program that is constantly running and that you sort of like send information to, you just interact with it like you would any other library in your application. And you just directly talk about the data transformations you want to do and essentially directly manipulate files in your file system. And there are things like this. So there's a thing called SQLite, which is basically, it's a database, but it's a database as a library. So it's not a standalone program. You have to like import it into your own code and interact with it. And the idea behind Muir was this, like, how do you bring that to serverless? So how do you have this serverless experience, but it's actually not serverless. It's actually more like a blockchain smart contract, where it's just a bunch of logic that sits somewhere, and then you pick up that logic and you apply it as a transformation over, in our case, it was a graph. And you sort of result in a graph transformation. And you can use very similar concepts to blockchains and sharding for trying to localize like the transformation of the data with the actual data itself. And that was just an interesting concept to me.
Well, what I wanted to ask was, I mean, maybe this is like not the point you're making, but so when I made this, we're looking at AJ's Quest like questions, and I have a bunch of questions that I've like put in this. I didn't store this in the MongoDB database somewhere else and then query it. What I did was I just put the file with the code, right? I have like a JSON file that just sits there and it just can load it immediately. Is that what you're talking about when the data's living with the code? Okay.
Yeah, pretty much. And because in a traditional system, what happens is you would have a program that talks to it, like sends a request to the database. The database then loads the file into the database, transforms it in some way, and then sends that data back to you over the network. So you're kind of doubling the amount of work that you're doing, because you're also having to send it over a network connection. And even if that network connection is local, you're doing a bunch of I/O that you just don't need to do if it's integrated.
Yeah, I do notice, like, for example, when I load my my Beehive blog posts, like there's a loading time because it has to go like fetch it and then it comes back, versus the questions that just load immediately because it lives with the code base. And I keep wondering, like, I don't fully understand why I even have a database at that point. I guess it's like very clunky if you keep everything like that side. And I guess user side, you also don't want to expose that, I guess, in some regard. I don't know.
Databases use file systems in very, very specific ways. Okay. Like if you think about an actual production database, the file system is not going to look like a bunch of individual files where each file is like a chunk of data. It's like this, just from your perspective, it's like a bunch of random bytes stored on the disk. It's like SQL stores everything as like one singularly big file, right? And then you have all this logic around how do you make sure that if your hard drive crashes, that you don't lose your data, right? So how do you replicate it? How do you make it fault tolerant? How do you know when something is actually being written? Like, how do you know that something actually has been saved on the disk and it's safe to move on? They use, like, how do you do things optimistically so you can kind of like write to it and know that it's written, but then like let the actual flushing to the disk happen later. So there's all these kinds of optimizations, and the deeper you go into them, the more that they require a level of like always on logic. And that's, I think, why they ended up being separate programs. Also, just like conceptually, it's easier to set up extra, like these separate programs. The hardware requirement of databases is often different. So like databases are obviously very I/O heavy and maybe less CPU heavy. Whereas, your serverless function might be CPU heavy, but not data heavy, right? And so it's like, how do you tune these? But as you move more and more into the cloud and you have these more abstract notions of just like, hey, there's just bulk hardware that's always got however much memory you want, however much storage you want, however many CPUs you want, and you just pay for what you use as you use it. Those models stopped making sense, but like the databases have been around for 50 years and they're super, super sophisticated. So like trying to resolve a lot of their problems just in a new context of it being libraries only is really, really challenging. It's doable, but it will take 10 years. And you got to build a business around it in the meantime.
10 years, really? How do you come up with a number like that? Is that a function of like distribution? Is that a function of like solving a lot of mathematical problems, or like what exactly is taking that much time?
So, I mean, like
in general, by the way, like I find it, I don't fully understand why when someone's like, oh, this software is going to take 10 years to build. Like I can understand that in like a nuclear fusion perspective, but for some reason, when it comes to like software, I don't fully understand why it would take that long.
There's two elements. So first of all, Postgres, which is probably my favorite database, was built 30 years ago, more or less. So even if you did a full rewrite from scratch and wanted every single feature that it gave you, how long do you reckon that's going to take? Like 1/3 of the time? Like maybe you could measure, maybe it's more like 10 man years. And yeah, you could compress that into 2-3 years by hiring a shit ton of people, right? Really great people. So maybe you call it like 10 expert years, and you could crunch that down and blow that up by getting the wrong people on it and more people and faster resources. And, so fine, whatever. Call it 1/3 of that straight out of the box. You could call even less than that. But really, for something like a database, the reality comes from bug fixing. So when you think about database implementations, they are zero failure tolerated, right? It cannot fail because some people, they use it really casually for AJ's Quest. They don't give a fuck. But some people, they save, like the citizenship information of their citizens on this database. Like that cannot fail, right? You cannot lose someone's citizen identity to a hardware fault, right? You have to have software that can abstract over those hardware faults. You can't have bugs. And so like how long does a piece of software have to be in production, and how battle tested does it have to be, and how many cycles of like, oh shit, we found a bug, we fixed it, we found a bug, we fixed it, do you have to go through before you're confident to say this thing is up to scratch? So it's definitely not like 10 years to rebuild Postgres and sort of get it up to feature parity, but to get it to battle readiness parity takes pretty much by definition that long, because like Postgres has been in production for 30 years, like 30 years of of bug fixes behind them.
So it's just a function of time because of how much effort goes into it. Like kind of like carving a wooden statue. You just physically just have to take the time to do it, as opposed to there's a lot of things you have to discover and
Yeah, and I think one thing that people underestimate for software that has lived this long is that the problems that we found in the first 10 years, right? They're not known by anyone anymore, right? There'll be a line of code somewhere in Postgres that solves a bug that was found 10 years ago that no one has ever encountered in 20 years because that person has retired.
This comes back to the whole skill issue that we talked about last time, right? Like,
a little bit.
What about, we're going, I guess there is no topic, so it doesn't really matter. But like when people say things like, oh, blockchain is so early, like there's so many things that will be like discovered over time. And like part of me just thinks like, really, is there like a function of innovation, or like is there a function of discovery that needs to happen over time? Like, it's just a database, like fundamentally, right? Like, sure, maybe you're coming up with new consensus mechanisms or something, but like, it doesn't seem like there's meaningful discoveries to have that will change the game in such a way.
Let's go back to the fault tolerance example because it's easy to think about. If you're a bank and computers first become a thing, and they're like, hey, we have this thing called a database, and you can store all your financial records in there. But it fails every 100 writes. Every 100th thing you write to it just can disappear into the void. You'd be like, no. Right? Like for AJ's to-do app, sure, because that 100th thing that, when I click send and it actually didn't save it and I have to rewrite it again, it's not a big deal. But there's a huge difference between a system that needs to be 99% fault tolerant and a system that needs to be 99.99999% tolerant.
But what's actually changed from a technical level, say, like for blockchain in general since 2009? Like, are we 90% of the way there? Like, I guess I get confused when people say like
to where? 90% of the way to what?
To like the maximal sort of like to the end state, right? Like whatever blockchain looks like at the complete end state from a technical perspective. Like, I just get confused when people say things like, oh, we're so early, like there's so many discoveries to happen, and they make it sound like technically we're only like 1 or 2% of the way there.
So I think like one of the challenges with that framing is that people are talking about different things when they say that. When they say we're so early, to some extent they're also talking about general consensus mechanisms, right? So there's something that I'm getting increasingly interested in, which is DeSci, right? So there was blockchain for a little while, and then I went to this like, oh, DeFi, can we do decentralized finance? Originally it was like, can we just decentralize all the things? Can we have like decentralized Uber, decentralized Airbnb, and that kind of like, then there was DeFi. And what people meant by we're so early there is like, at some point someone invented Uniswap, right? And everyone's like, oh shit, like there is actually a completely permissionless, autonomous way to balance trading pools. And we hadn't really realized it. Did some fundamental change happen to the blockchain infrastructure to make that possible? No. Someone just figured out the X times Y equals K equation works well on a blockchain and then scaled that up. And then people innovated on that. The blockchain, no, it didn't change, right? But then, you have a similar thing transforming, when people figured out that they could do like, what's it called? Like perpetuals, right, on the blockchain, that you didn't need an intermediate to deal with like the leverage and the unwinding. And then, now people are doing DeSci. And DeSci is really early because they're like, how do we coordinate capital? There's this weird thing where we have to do stuff in the real world and actually like run experiments, and like, how do you validate that? And like, there are problems to be solved. And in that sense, we're early, and people are often trying to pitch this idea that there are applications that we haven't figured out and consensus mechanisms that are specific to those applications that we haven't figured out. Sometimes people do mean technically, and they mean like the scale and all of that. And I would argue that depending on your application, we're already there, right? And like, one thing that people like, I never really understood is, oh, it's so expensive to send money on the blockchain. Like, have you tried sending money internationally ever? Like, both time and cost, right? Like, I wanted to remit like over $100,000 to Hong Kong, like 2 years ago, right? Maybe even longer, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And I because it was more than my amount that my bank allowed me to do online, I had to physically go into the bank, bring my passport, and like double sign some fucking bullshit. So it took like, including all my transit time, took like an hour and a bit, right? And it cost me $40 in remittance fees. When was the last time that a blockchain transaction cost anywhere near that much or had that price? So depending on the use case, we're already there.
Yeah.
Right.
I think even if you were to transfer like $40 or something and use Western Union, you're still getting hit by remittance fees quite hard. So, the use case is the same across different levels. So that's fair. I think the reason why I asked this, and I actually think that you had a great answer to it, so, that's fair, is because I can see the rate of progression, or I guess I can see where we need to go for, say, something like quantum computing, where we just need to entangle more qubits, and like there is like a very clear pathway to like we need to get further and further, right? And it's clear to me that like it's almost like a function of time. Like we'll get better and better as we discover new things to do that. And then like I think about a technology like blockchain, which feels well formed, and like I don't actually know what that like progression looks like. Some people say like throughput or like transaction speed, but then other people say that's actually probably antithetical to like what we're actually trying to do, because then it messes up the entire system, makes it less decentralized. So like, yeah, I think you had a pretty good answer. The Uniswap example was a good one, where I think that did change the game quite a bit, at least for me personally. Like, just made my life a lot easier. So, makes sense.
Yeah, and I think there's innovation happening like that behind the scenes all the time. I think there are some big problems that are probably solvable, like dark pools, that haven't been solved yet. And there's actually a new wave of people trying to solve these things. I think zero knowledge cryptography is going to be one of the big things that pushes this forward. Like a fully homomorphic encryption also going to massively push things forward, because it unlocks this notion of privacy and like really, really good compression.
Is anyone working on that in a meaningful way?
Yeah. It's a huge sub-industry.
Okay, I'd love to do an episode on homomorphic encryption, or just like zero knowledge proofs.
Yeah, fuck yeah.
That's that is actually really exciting to me. So speaking of blockchains, I have no segue, so we're just going to go straight into Japanese convenience stores. Have you seen what Lawson is doing with
Wait, I've got a segue. I've got a segue for you.
Okay, go for it.
Have you been to Japan and tried to spend money there?
Yeah.
Like, what do you think of their financial infrastructure?
That was fine. I just paid with my like Apple Pay or like card sometimes, and then cash the other times, and like
I found that like it's the most cash heavy country that I go to.
Oh, I guess it depends where you're going, right? Like if you're in Tokyo, like you can use your card pretty easily, but then as soon as you go outside of that, then you have to use cash quite a bit. I just withdrew a lot of cash. So
I reckon this is like, here's my pitch, is that once we do figure out like day-to-day payment rails on blockchain, Japan's going to be in the envious position of being able to do what like usually second world countries do, and just like skip like Visa and MasterCard at mass scale and just like go straight to blockchain settlements.
Well, I mean, this is what China did with like QR codes, right? They skipped cards altogether and went straight to like QR code payments, and it's just like,
exactly.
That blew my mind when there were places I went to and it was just like, sorry, we only take Alipay or WeChat Pay. I'm like, the fuck? Like,
there's some places in Singapore that are like that. Yeah, they're the same. Oh, they always take cash though.
So I went to a place that didn't accept cash in Shanghai, I think. Yeah.
Okay, well, that's nuts.
Yeah.
Soon you're going to be able to walk into a Lawson in Japan and settle with crypto.
Yeah, probably. But on top of that, you're not going to be talking to an in-person person. I don't know how to say that. An in-person
human.
Face-to-face. You're not going to talk to anyone face-to-face. This is who you're going to be talking to. This is actually a human, so it's not an AI avatar, although like at some point, they could just replace the human. What they're doing at the moment is they're getting Japanese expatriates like who live overseas that can cover the graveyard shift for like the Lawson stores, and just like that you can see the webcam at the top. And so they just like watch the customer and like talk to them and like help them through the transaction essentially.
And appear as an anime character.
Yeah, like an avatar.
So for those who are just listening, I was very confused by this because it's a poster or like a screen of an anime avatar that is apparently a real human.
Yeah, we talked about VTubers, right? Like this is the natural progression.
It's always I'm too old to understand VTubers, man.
So the first person who did this was actually a Japanese expatriate in Sweden who ran a couple of stores in Tokyo and Osaka during like the overnight hours. And then they had a real person doing the stocking and like the other stuff. So then they didn't have to run back and forth. They could just focus on whatever they needed in person to do. There has to be a better way to say that.
So what does this not in-person do?
So just help with the transactions. So if the customer has any questions, they need to find something or they need help.
Right.
The actual transaction happens by yourself. So you self-service basically. But then if you need any help, the person's there. I think they have some remote controls to like sort of override transactions, things like that if needed.
So how soon before this is an AI?
I think pretty soon. Like I think that I'm guessing the reason, and maybe they didn't think about this deeply, is using the avatar means that you could just swap out the person really easily. There's no attachment to the actual human that's sitting across the world, like in their computer, right? So like it would just take a few seconds. Plus they're just getting a bunch of training data, right? Like they run the humans for like, you know, a couple of seasons and then they just have all the training data and they just run the AI. So at the moment, Lawson has 70 overseas employees running 29 stores. And they have the in-person person.
Are these people cheaper or more expensive than in-person people?
I believe it's about the same, although like that's a good question. Because if you're living in Sweden, you're probably your minimum wage is going to be higher than Japan, I'm guessing, just off the bat. Sweden seems like a more expensive country. So, unsure. Yeah, but this is an interesting one. I just found this so fascinating that they're like trialing it. Oh, this is another example. Like, so this is the avatar.
Oh, like actually at the counter. Yeah, that kind of makes sense.
Yeah. This article, by the way, like just, I guess, quick shout out to Japan Today. Like one of the employees at this company basically just went through the checkout and sort of like talked about his experience. It did not end well. Like he didn't like the experience. Apparently the clerk told him to press the orange button, but he couldn't find the orange button. So he just got frustrated and like rage quit. So like it was it effective? I don't know. That's the first one. So Lawson, potentially AI operated very soon. The next thing I had was just flight economics. How much do you know about the economics of flights in general?
I know they have to do a lot of stuff to offset the price of fuel, but I had an understanding that they make most of their money from business class and that economy is basically all cost recovery. But maybe I'm wrong.
No, you're pretty much right. Like what I think is interesting, and the next thing I picked was TVs, right? Is that flights and TVs basically went down in price over 10, 20 years, right? So,
I mean, I remember flights going up dramatically during and after the pandemic, and then never really came back down. But maybe
so if you just look at it on average from like 2014 to 2024, flights have gone down on average price about 44%. And what I think is interesting is like in a time of inflation where things like, traditional commodities like coffee and stuff is like going up in price, technically enabled businesses like TVs and flights are like technically going down because we get better at innovation, right? So this thing that, there's some categories that go down.
But that's really interesting because I wouldn't have thought that there's much innovation in how to make a flight cheaper. Maybe like the engines themselves can be more fuel efficient. Yeah,
probably. I mean, there has to be, right? Otherwise, like, how would they get down 44% since 2014?
Yeah.
So the other thing about the economics is that 5 billion people took a flight in 2024 on 40 million flights. And then the projected profits was, the profits were 5 billion people on 40 million flights in 2025. That's the projection, not 2024.
No, 5 billion people took flights. I was like, there's no way that's true. Okay, 5 billion,
individuals, unique individuals will take flights in 2025.
Wait, what? Unique individuals? So more than half the world gets on a plane?
Yeah.
What?
Yeah. That's wild, right?
Unique individual? Are you sure that's not just like, do I count as like 3 flights if I get on, like if I go from here to Singapore, Singapore to London, London to Melbourne? Like, is that 3? Are they clocking me 3 times?
So I say unique because the stat that was sort of generated at the end of this report was that the average profit per passenger. How can it be average profit per passenger if if they counted a passenger. I guess maybe passengers are
no,
unique.
Because there's a big difference between like I take 5 flights a year, so I count as like 5 people in a flight versus one unique person that happened to take 5 flights.
Yeah, you know what? You're probably right. I think
yeah, because like five like that's more than half the world is going to get on a plane. Like that can't be right.
Yeah, I did read that. I was like, oh, that's pretty wild. Okay, so I'm guessing if you caught the flight 5 different flights, then you count as 5 different passengers, and passengers a unique increment of like you being on a flight. Yeah. So 40 million flights. The projected profits was 36.6 billion people, but the average profit per passenger was actually a lot lower than like I thought. So the average profit per passenger, I mean, based on the region, is quite different as well. So Middle East is $23.10. North America is $10.30. Europe is $8.20. And Asia Pacific is just $1.80 per customer profit, which is wild. I don't even know why you would run an Asia Pacific like airlines at that point.
Someone's got it, right? It's just market see.
Yeah, so the total average was $7 of profit per passenger, which I think holds your I think your theory is right that like most of the profits come from business class and first class, because how you running a business on like if the average is $1.80, then the actual profit per economy class is probably closer to like a few cents or something like that, right?
Yeah,
so,
I mean, I remember reading a breakdown of it at some point where they said that on like that's how they structure themselves. So they try to break even on economy, and then they just upsell into business and first class.
So you're telling me that me sitting in economy class should be grateful and thankful to the people in business and first class because they're paying
Absolutely.
for my flight.
Yeah, kiss my feet as you pass. Actually, I think first class is actually you don't even pass them there.
Oh yeah. I'll make sure I come up and just like pay my respect.
Yeah. Appreciate
one of them.
I'll send some caviar back to you.
The other thing was this TV economics, which is like.
Wait, can we pause on flights for a second? Because we talked about this a couple of episodes ago, and I always really like articulating solid real-world examples of this. People often get very upset by like various complex financial instruments, and that's fair. A lot of these financial instruments just get abused by traders to like make money, but futures are a really, really amazing financial instrument, right? Because if you're a plane company, you know more or less how much fuel you're going to need this year. But if fuel prices change dramatically, that completely alters your economics. And as a airplane company, you don't want to be a gas and fuel trading company. Like you don't want to be trying to make money on gas and fuel trades. And even if you did want to do that, you couldn't sell at the peak because you still have to deliver on your flights. So even if you had the stock and you wanted to sell, like you couldn't. And so the idea is that futures allow you to lock in a price. So you basically say, I'm going to have on hand, like $1 billion worth of fuel. That's a long position in my fuel. So then if it doubles in price, I've made $1 billion in profit. So but I don't really want to do that. I don't want to play that game. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a short position that basically loses money if the price of fuel goes up, but makes money if the price of fuel goes down. You're betting against fuel. And so you basically align this such that you're neutral. So if the cost of fuel goes up, the amount of money that you make based on the fact that you have fuel versus the amount of money that you lose based on the fact that you've held a short position perfectly cancels out and you stay neutral. And this allows airplane companies to get a predictable pricing for what their fuel is going to be. And if you didn't have that, you would just see, like what's really amazing about flights is if you overlay the cost of flights over a year compared to the cost of fuel, they're incredibly stable. Right. And when you think that fuel is the primary cost of running one of these flights, that's an incredible achievement. And it's actually a financial instrument achievement that we have complex enough, integrated enough, and global enough financial markets that that's possible. And planes are just a beautiful example of how that actually ultimately benefits the consumer. Right. These big, crazy, opaque, Illuminati financial institutions witchcrafting their magic. This is actually an example where it really matters for the end consumer in a very tangible way. Sorry, I just wanted to go on that rant because finance gets a lot of like negative light.
You're totally right. And I think that's such a perfect example. I think I definitely started appreciating financial instruments more when I started dealing with multiple currencies and I had currency risk and I had to start thinking about like, okay, should I hedge this or short this currency? And I can totally appreciate how that impacts like a business. And we talked about cocoa prices like recently, right? That just like spiked. But it's not like our local chocolate just like spiked immediately. Like maybe in 6 months from now we might feel it.
It was definitely mitigated.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. This one is just a really quick example, but when I was looking into flights, I looked into televisions, and, you know, coming off the back of like thinking about housing prices have just like increased so much in Sydney, and like thinking about buying a house just made me sad. I thought this was just cool. The fact that like the price of a television in 1950 was $1,000, and then in 2024, that TV for an equivalent purchase is $6.71.
So
right?
That's inflation adjusted.
Yes, which is just like wild. Like it's like technology helping you like make that price go all the way down. Granted, like, you know, TV in 1950s was like not much of a TV today by today's standards, but
that's not even granted. That's like more to the point, right? Not only is the TV like whatever that is 20 times cheaper, it's also like 20 times better. It's bigger, it's flatter, it's more energy efficient, it's crisper, it's got better colors. We've got more TV programs. Like,
yeah, like this came off because I was watching this video and this guy predicting what would happen in 5 years, like, you know, what's going to happen in 2030. And just like such an offhanded comment he made was like, oh, we all have 100-inch TVs because now they're just really cheap. Like the price per inch for a TV is just like reduced quite dramatically. So we just all have 100-inch TVs. And I was like, what? Is that true? And then I looked into it and I was like, oh, that is true.
Yeah, like a 10x the brain rot for 1/10 the price.
Yeah. The last thing I have for you is like...
Wait, did you go into why they're cheaper? Is it manufacturing processes? Is it like the elements that they're made of are cheaper? Like what is the, you know, is it that we offload everything to China? Like, okay.
It's all of the above, like technical improvements. Then we have like manufacturing efficiency processes. Like there's just so many things. I think TV is just like one of the best examples of technology just making things really cheap, aside from like computers and things like that. But TV was just like a cool example. But no, I didn't go into the details on like which parts of it contributed to the deflation. The next thing I got for you is like I don't know if you want to call it an expose, like my amateur investigation into like a well-known entity. How much do you know about Burning Man?
Zilch. I mean, like, okay. I know what is sort of known through its PR processes, and it's generally its public image, which, as I understand, it's kind of gone down recently. Like, it's kind of seems like a bit of a poser thing.
Would you ever go?
No.
Okay. I've never considered going, but like after reading, I'm like, sounds kind of interesting. But basically, a bunch of people go to the middle of the desert and like it's lawless, so like you barter your way to getting things. But like over time, it's just become bigger and bigger, and like now there's like huge performances and like light shows and like random stuff that happens. There's a lot more people that go than I thought. So in 2024, it was 66,000 people that came. I was analyzing their ticket sales, and like I thought it was interesting that they had so many different ticket tiers. And if you just look at like this wall of text, basically they have the FOMO sale, the steward sale, the ticket aid for people that can't afford the main ticket, the OMG sale, and I think there was like a few other sales that just like those are kids tickets and like random stuff like that. All in all, we're talking like, you know, tens of millions of dollars. $38.2 million just from these tickets. I thought it was interesting that they have like a premium ticket sale for like the rich people that just like don't want to miss out on the main sale. So yeah, if you're rich and want to pay a bit extra just to ensure you get your ticket, you can buy a ticket for $2,500 or buy a ticket for $1,500. Don't understand why there's a pricing difference and when they sort of sell out, but you know, that's often
for these kind of like stay festivals, there are different areas as well, right, that you're allowed to camp in.
Yeah. So this is like somewhat interesting, but the more interesting thing is that Burning Man actually publishes their financials to their website. So you can like go through their financials for like the last 10 years, except they stopped publishing it in 2023. Right. And like, I was like, oh, that's interesting. And so you look at the financials here. their profit and loss per attendee, you can see that they pretty much lost money per attendee every single year, except for these 2 years, which they didn't run because of COVID, essentially, right? And you can see the losses start to get like bigger and bigger each year. Like we're getting to $200 lost per person. If you times that by 66,000, like you're starting to get some pretty solid losses.
I was going to say, when you first told me the sale ticket prices, I'm like, for what I understand about Burning Man, 38 million is not enough revenue.
Yeah, I don't understand like I don't even actually really understand what they're spending it on. Proportional revenue, all their revenue basically comes from program revenue, right? The ticket sales and things like that. They have a very, obviously in 2020, 2021, when COVID hit, they relied mostly on contributions. But I thought what was interesting was that they came out with a press release saying that they are short $14 million, despite all this money that they've made. And then when you dig into it, like, they have 110 staff members that go to trips to Europe. And then also they have some fixed assets on their balance sheet, which is like staff housing. So they're like buying houses for their team members or whatever. And so, yeah, it's a really odd, like, sort of usage of funds. I'm not going to make any sweeping declarations, but I'm so curious if like CoffeeZilla comes out with like an expose, or like someone comes out with an expose.
Look, I mean, it's a really interesting one. So what I know from a festival of a similar style is this one called Woodford that happens in Australia, similar size, different like theme. And certainly, I mean, that's like $14 million shortfall sounds about right, because what, 60,000, 70,000 times 200, that's 14 million, right? So that's on par with kind of the numbers you were just showing above in terms of what they're losing out on. I know that at Woodford, because of the installations that they have, they actually do need full-time staff there to maintain it throughout the year. And that the preparation, like they build so much infrastructure that they need people on site to actually do the building. But that, like, I understood Burning Man to be like a rock up to an empty desert. The festival assembles itself, and then everyone fucks off, right? So maybe other than that,
that's what I thought.
That are actually
which is why
there.
I'm confused why there's so much spending on it. Like, what are they doing? I looked at the images.
There must be common infrastructure, right, that gets set up, like toilets and showers and like the stages.
But I think that the article that came out, like people are pissed because I think they just asked for money. I think they asked for like 10 million or something, and then they've asked for another 14 million, saying that they have a shortfall. But then, like, what people are annoyed about is that there's like random people on the team, like a director of philosophical center and director of creative initiatives, that like no one knows what they actually do in the company. And there's people flying to Europe to do partnerships stuff, which like people don't understand why are people flying to Europe all the time and like spending all this stuff. And then there's random assets on their balance sheet. So like, I think people are starting to like question where exactly this money is going. And so that's why like I wanted to flag it early. I didn't want to make a sweeping declaration on it. But if CoffeeZilla or like someone does like a cool expose, like, you know, I'll be like, you know, I said it first.
Well, you know, we have our episode title, right? Like Burning Man Exposed. And then someone has to sit through 15 minutes of bullshit just to get to like, yeah, maybe something's just badly managed here.
I think the first part was more interesting, to be honest. Yeah, that's all I got for you. Like very shallow researches, but like, you know, things that I thought were really interesting. I'm still deciding whether I want to do deep dives or like just rapid fire. Here's a few interesting things I've noticed this week.
I don't think it matters, right? Like, I mean, if you happen to be caught by a couple of things and only go shallow on them versus like caught by one thing that you go really deep on. The latter is usually my style. I just get like nerd sniped by something and then I go deep on it.
Yeah, I'm a very shallow person. I like depth. So, yeah, it's fine.
And the reason I wanted to do lightning is I saw this like little Gozgasagt short video. It's like 1:30 about lightning.
Did that just come out? Or is that old video?
It's not like old. I think it's like maybe a month or two old.
Okay. Should I check it out or should I wait?
Nah, save it. Save it. We can watch it together.
Okay. Sounds good.
It's a better explanation than I'll be able to give.
Anything else before we wrap up?
No.
So are we expecting lightning next week? Like, are you making that commitment?
I'm making that commitment softly, maybe. No promises.
Okay.
Guaranteed.
I think we have our episode with Billy next week. So
the week after. Yep.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, thanks for listening, everyone. And make sure you subscribe. If you're in the first 100 people, you're going to be one of these people that know about the expose before it goes like mainstream, and you'd be like, I'm that guy, right? So
I've also heard AJ claim that he's going to put on lipstick and kiss 100 postcards and send them out to our first 100 subscribers. So get ready for that.
You know what? I will do that if you get to like 10,000 subscribers. In the first 100, we'll get the kissed postcard.
I thought you were going to say 10,000. Like, you're going to have chapped lips by the end of
it. No. The first 100, we'll get one. Although, like, I don't really know how I'm going to get your mailing address and like all that information from all you guys. So, like, we'll figure out the logistics if we make it happen. So, the first 100 of you should be like enlisting another 100 people to join. That way, we get to 10,000, you get your kissed postcard. But you should do something too, because your time is more valuable than mine. Remember, it's like
I'll look at the postcards.
You what?
I'll look at them.
Oh,
they've been.
That makes sense. I think value-wise, about the same. All right. See you guys.